Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a sort of an improvised Quickie article. It's not actually on the Quickie, this article, but it's something I just kind of felt like maybe one of these days I'll actually write up an article on the Quickie in this style, but I wanted to explain a little bit about it because this is what I'm dubbing Chris and Dignity. You may be asking yourselves at this moment, does Chris technically have any dignity? Yes? No? Well, it's actually a little bit more confusing than that. First of all, there's the the dictionary definition of the word dignity. 1. Noun, the state or quality of being worthy of honour or respect. 2. A composed or series, manner or style. So, I know for anyone who's ever been familiar at all with Chris Chan over these last number of years will know that Chris doesn't really he doesn't really exercise his level of dignity, because on multiple occasions Chris, duped because of the guise of trolls, but we'll get to that in a moment, will do outrageous, outlandish things that not even any one of us would ever consider doing, because we know that it will make us look bad, and we know fine well that in the long run it's simply not worth the hassle and all the aggro. For example, remember when Jackie convinced Chris to dress up as Mr. Popo, and Chris willingly accepted and then sang an improvised version of by the Crash Test Dummies, accompanied with Ain't No Saints on a Fiddle, No Saints on a Fiddle Like This. And how, for any one of us, if we ever did something like that, forget being cancelled, forget the fact that we would be recognised walking down the street, it's why on earth would we even contemplate doing that? And considering that isn't the most outrageous thing that Chris Chan has ever done in his life, that would be a big black mark on his dignity, is one and the same. And you may also recall that I famously said is that it certainly goes to show how much Chris prioritizes losing his virginity. Certainly more than he prioritizes his own dignity. Because what exactly in terms of manner, style, or quality, or state of quality Chris is or can ever be, where things become so bad that he is, well, encouraged, I don't really want to say forced, because forced isn't really the right word. Chris ultimately had the chance or the choice to say that he didn't have to do any of these things, so there's that. But why would Chris really go out of his way to do stuff like this? Well, a lot of this can be pointed towards not so much his autism, but his egotism. The idea being is that Chris considers himself almost in a league apart from ordinary people, to which every fart, bubble and squeak that Chris ever produces is of merit, and therefore should be seen as an example of his superb and divine character. The issue with this in relation to his dignity is that he thinks that nothing is really beneath his dignity. From shoving medallions up his ass to creating sex tapes with Julie, or, like I mentioned before, not just with the Mr. Popo video in regards to Jackie, but a whole range of other things. There was nothing really beneath Chris's dignity, because of the fact that Chris doesn't really seem to have much of a concept of shame. But like with dignity, this is also something that is a little more confusing, because Chris does exhibit some levels of shame. For example, the cake farts video. Chris has still said that that is the one thing he ultimately regrets, and since there's been no change or evidence to the contrary that he regrets doing anything else, we have to accept this almost as gospel, that to this very day, the one thing Chris has shame and regrets doing was sitting on an $11 cake. A response that, quite frankly, speaks for itself. But this also does beg the question of whether or not it's Chris's ultimate lack of shame is why he doesn't really pay much heed towards his dignity, or why he has continued to done outrageous things without the benefit of foresight. But no, it's not even the benefit of foresight, but the benefit of initiative. I mean, you could argue that Chris took the initiative to make things completely of his own volition and regard, such as his 25th birthday message video, but that video was more mired by Chris's incompetence, his ignorance of the world, and sustained by his still then outdated views towards the real world, and the fact that it's completely within people's rights to do. Chris doesn't really seem to understand the concept that just because Chris considers himself important, it means that he thinks his opinions over other people are more important. Which is why it's probably more the fashion, you could say, that it's hard for Chris to exhibit. Chris doesn't seem to have much in the way of like dignifying others, and the best example of this is in regards to women. We know through examples in the past that Chris has tried to purposefully get close to women, violating their space and not really taking much regards to their dignity, because Chris ultimately believes women are just playthings, things that he can treat however as they like. And this sentiment hasn't just gone away just because Chris considers himself bisexual or transsexual, aka too many games. Chris thought it was a good idea to violate other people's space by trying to peck people on the cheek without asking. And of course, as we know, it doesn't do Chris's dignity any good whatsoever, because it still makes him look something that ultimately he has gone on record to try and say he is not. A monster. Which, I know it's a very outdated thing to mention such things, because we know fine well that despite what Chris says, it's what Chris does is what people are going to remember him as well as all the things he said, is that when it comes to dignity, it only ever matters in regards to Chris as long as people are being dignified and considerate towards him. It's not important for Chris to reciprocate this level of generosity, this level of tact. All of these things are just things that only matter in regards to how people treat Chris. It's not necessarily applicable for Chris to treat people with the same level of courtesy. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the sort of the underlying issues that people have always had when it comes to Chris's approach towards his own dignity, is that Chris doesn't really seem to care much about other people, because ultimately Chris has very little regards to caring for himself, apart from times when he feels like it's justified and warranted, aka when it's down to things that he wants as opposed to things he needs. Ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, and I know you've probably heard me say this a few times before, is that sometimes in life there is no such thing as good or bad. There are only consequences. And the consequences that we pay are for the consequences we choose to act. And when it comes to Chris, the consequences of his actions make us believe that the only thing that really matters in his life is himself, at the expense of his reputation, at the expense of his dignity, and at expense of the foresight to know that maybe, just maybe, Chris should have actually thought about what he was doing before he decided to go out of his way. And with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys have enjoyed this more improvised quickie reading, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.